Hello, everyone. I am talking with Bill Jennings, Senior Director at Delta Consulting Group. Bill, how are you?
I'm well, Hernan. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to hear you as well. So, one of the things that I would like to talk with you a little bit about has to do with the different risks and trends and technologies that you're hearing about, seeing about, working on. What's happening out there that internal auditors and compliance professionals should know about? So, let's talk about risk, trends, and technologies. What are you hearing about?
Well, a couple of things that are important. Obviously the many of the risks that existed in the past are still with us, but there are some emerging things I think that people need to be aware of. One
Mhm.
is I was at the White Collar Crime Institute in Miami last week, and one of the things I
Oh,
learned is
great.
that the Deputy Attorney General spoke, and she made it clear that the government is now very narrowly focused on compliance. So not only in sort of black letter compliance, but also in the spirit of compliance. And so organizations are going to be judged based on um, the seriousness with which they take putting in place controls to address compliance with laws, regulations, and of course their internal policies and procedures. So that is a huge shift for the government. So the government was giving credit in the past for companies that had compliance systems in place. The change is that credit will only be given to the extent that those systems are actually demonstrably working.
So, do you feel that, or maybe they explicitly said so, but do you think that the FTX collapse maybe influenced that change in tenor because of the magnitude and the speed at which everything collapsed in that environment?
Well, I think the government was actually shifting to this policy earlier.
Uh-huh.
And their idea was that they were unable to police the enormous number of entities that are subject to their jurisdiction. And so,
Hmm.
a way to address that is to have a very narrow focus on making sure that all organizations realize that they will be given credit for compliance, but they will also be punished when they either disregard or fail to seriously pursue compliance. Now, I will tell you that FTX has had an impact. The
Hmm.
CFTC, the SEC, and also the Department of Justice are very narrowly focused on that matter, and they all come at it in different ways. But the message is clear that for crypto assets, because as it turns out, that's a much wider field than just cryptocurrency. But for crypto
Right.
assets in general, the government is spending an enormous amount of resources focusing on those with a view to protecting the investing public.
So they're looking at these. Well, they're based on blockchain technology, but so have they decided whether it's an asset or a tradable commodity, or what is it in terms of its definition? Because I know for a while that was a big debate whether or not this was a way of holding value, like an asset, like a building or something like that, whether it was like a currency that you could exchange, buy and sell. I mean, you can still do the same with assets, but quite often you have to use money to buy or sell it. But this itself was considered a currency. So are they closer to defining it in such a way, or is that still a little bit uncertain?
It's a little bit uncertain. It depends on the agency, and they're all sort of
Hmm.
looking to Congress to create a legal definition. But the
Uh-huh.
IRS regards it as a security. And I believe the
Okay.
SEC looks at it as security as well. CFTC has taken more of an agnostic approach to the definition and believes that its duty is to regulate it, whether it's a currency or a security. And Department of Justice has the most interesting approach of all. They
Mhm.
actually don't take any chances. They view it as both a currency and a security. So when they indict criminal
Either.
conduct
Okay.
like FTX, they will indict it under statutes that relate to currencies as well as statutes that relate to securities.
Yeah. I think this is consistent with what we have seen over the many years, right? Where
Yes.
technologies lead and the regulations and the controls follow. And in this case, we find that it's just gained so much value that it's become very dangerous, really, for some people in terms of how much they can possibly lose and the speed at which it's moving. Now, this also has international implications. So you have different governments that are also looking into this, not only creating their own cryptocurrencies, but also how they're regulating it. Was there anything said about how, from an international perspective, they were going to address it, since money laundering is one of the ways that they use some of these instruments?
They are working with other governments, but all of the federal agencies made the point that if you are dealing with an offshore entity like FTX, for instance, you are, it's let the buyer beware. You're taking on a great deal of additional risk because the U.S. government does not have the ability at this point to regulate its operation until it violates U.S. laws. So, their point was, if you're investing in an entity that's offshore, let the buyer beware. From a money laundering standpoint, the government's become quite sophisticated, actually, at blockchain technology. In fact, they've spent an enormous amount of money hiring data scientists and others to help them cope with the identification exchange of blockchain assets. And so the U.S. government has the ability to monitor those transactions and also intervene, because when you try to monetize the assets, if you want to exchange them for U.S. dollars, those transactions have to clear through New York banks, and the government is closely monitoring all of those exchanges and does have the ability to stop the transfer of monetary assets created from blockchain assets.
Okay. I will imagine also is going to start to get into taxation at some point, and as far as financial reporting as well, right? The SEC is probably not going to be long before they start to come up with some mechanism to try to increase some kind of financial reporting, I will imagine, just like they do with stock trading or mutual funds and other instruments. In terms of other uses of blockchain, so you just spoke a bit about how it's used as a currency, as an asset, but in terms of other uses of blockchain, what are you seeing or hearing in terms of what they're doing with it?
Well, it's fascinating. So, in addition to currencies, many people have heard about non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, that are based on blockchain technology. And the former president, in fact, recently released a number of NFT images for sale, which were quite interesting. But there are many, many, many ways in which blockchain technology is used to create intellectual property assets and to buy and sell those. So, an example might be that if you were, for instance, a movie producer, you could circulate what would be the equivalent of an RFP to have people write a script from, let's say, a book. And all of these script writers, anywhere in the world, actually, um, could write either an entire script or parts of a script, and then have those encoded using blockchain technology and then submitted for consideration. Now, if the producer decides to buy it, they would buy the blockchain asset that has that either part or entire script attached to it, and then they would be free to then sell that blockchain asset to others. And so there are exchanges, actually, for all kinds of intellectual property that are essentially tied to blockchain, identifiers, so that they can be bought and sold. I mean, it's really fascinating. I see no end in sight.
So it allows you to make it a unique item, which is, I would imagine, from I guess is it helpful so that you can basically protect what you've created and you can basically claim ownership over it. Is that one of the ways it's being looked at? That is allowable now for the individual to say, okay, this is mine, and here is the proof that it is mine because the blockchain that goes with it.
Yeah, exactly. Most intellectual property law, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but most intellectual property law, as I understand it, is based on being able to demonstrate that you created the thing, that you were the author of whatever it is. And one of the great problems with that in the past has been that there's been no way to authenticate things. And so people use very complex agreements, which are quite expensive and also limit participants, because you've got to spend money to create contracts, even things like non-disclosure agreements. You're not going to deal with, for instance, a script writer who's never written a script, right? It's not worth the money. But if, on the other hand, those script writers can create their own intellectual property protection through blockchain technology, then they are free to submit those things without having to worry about contracts and non-disclosure agreements. And so it opens up that opportunity to a much wider universe of authors or other, intellectual property creators. I mean, it's really and it's exploded. I mean, it's just amazing the speed at which this is expanding.
This is fantastic, Bill. Thank you very much for helping us better understand some of these uses. I would like to continue this conversation, but let's take a short break and then we'll come back and talk about some of the other developments that are impacting our economy when it comes to some of these technologies.
Tired of trying to schedule your team's time around in-person learning? Isn't it a bummer to spend thousands of dollars on travel for professional development? What if we said you can save money and time and still provide your team with the best training possible? The answer to your woes is live online training from ACI Learning. With live online training, we provide our top in-person courses in private, online, instructor-led formats. You get to provide professional development in a manner that fits today's expectations. Entertaining, convenient, and effective. Our exam-aligned courses inspire the full potential of your team. Visit virtual instructor-led training at ACI Learning for more info.
Bill, so as we're talking about different things that are happening in our economy, how about we chat a little bit about what the government is doing and focusing on when it comes to big data? What are some of the things happening there?
So the government actually has spent an enormous amount of money hiring data scientists and others to help them to gather and analyze data across all of their areas of jurisdictional interest. And the implications for private corporations and for internal auditors is that it's no longer the case that the government is relying on tools as they did in healthcare regulation, like statistical sampling. They have now moved into analyzing extraordinarily large amounts of data, and they are using that data to identify anomalies for investigation. So, let's take the healthcare space. So those government regulators are collecting data from all aspects of reimbursement from government programs. And what they are identifying are areas where there are unexplainable increases in different types of requests for reimbursement. So some of the hot areas at the moment are DNA testing, also certain types of compounding pharmacy expenditures where there are related requests for reimbursement.
There was a lot of talk for a while about things like opioids and overprescribing those. Is that also an example of areas where they are looking at data as well? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you're on the private side, so whether you're a healthcare provider or healthcare insurer related entity, you've got to be aware of that. and you have to also, in order to satisfy the government's expectations, again, related to compliance, you've got to have systems in place where you can monitor the same data the government's monitoring and identify, any of those anomalies for investigation before the government does. Because you get, one thing I failed to say earlier is you get tremendous credit for self-reporting. So if you are a regulated entity, or any private entity that would run afoul of any of the criminal laws, so let's say you're not a regulated entity, but you've got FCPA exposure, you get tremendous credit for self-reporting and for having systems in place. The government's incidentally especially interested in systems in place to identify individual actors within your organization and clawing back compensation from those individual actors. Even if you're not successful in the clawback, the fact that you identified that individual and attempted the clawback will give you tremendous credit in any possible government criminal proceeding. And
so it sounds like compliance. So it sounds like compliance is moving the space of governance, which we've always seen those as being related, right, in terms of GRC. But sometimes when we think about compliance, the approach is somewhat simplistic, let's call it that, in terms of here's a control and I can show you that the control was performed. But of course, a lot of things will siphon through and go through because of manipulation, management overrides, reclassification of transactions, a lot of different ways that people could circumvent the controls. So it sounds to me like the government is basically saying, okay, the real thing here is governance, and you showing us that you have mechanisms in place, not only setting expectations but monitoring. And if you see something as anomalous, you take responsibility, take over the situation, and communicate that to us to let us know that something is amiss, and that shows that you're really trying to govern the organization effectively. Is that kind of the tone that you're hearing now?
That's exactly right. And in the government, the thing that's odd about it, Hernan, is the government's not waiting for any sort of response from industry. They're just taking these actions. They're letting you know. And of course, the way your organization is going to learn about it is through the general counsel's office, right? So they're going to be, there's Lisa Monaco's deputy attorney general has issued this letter, which I'm certain will be called in the future the Monaco letter, just like we had the Thompson memo and, all of these things over the years. But it's going to say, here's what we expect. It's and they're not, the Justice Department's not waiting for corporations to tell them whether they're happy with those expectations or not. They're saying this is what we expect. And
so there's no comment period.
No comment period, exactly. And so they're basically saying if you do these things, you're going to come out very well, and if you don't do them, we're going to punish you.
And when we started the conversation, you were also telling me that, or you're sharing with us anyway, that we're basically seeing a little bit more collaboration among agencies. Is that correct as well?
Huge collaboration among agencies. Yeah, no more silos. So they're all, to the extent that they are legally permitted to do so, they're sharing as much information as they can with one another, and making cross referrals as quickly as they can. And that's a big change. That's an important thing that you've identified. That's a huge change. Now,
another question that I have. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, another question that I have then has to do with the funding then. So greater, more specific rules and regulations, more focus given to anomalies, looking in terms of putting more of the burden on the organizations themselves to identify and self-report, better collaboration. Are they having their budgets increased so that they can do the work and they can enforce it as we're discussing?
I think the answer is twofold. So, yes, they're having their budgets increased, and they're also redirecting their budgets away from enforcement activities that they view to be less necessary and towards these emerging trends. It's just, I mean, it's really interesting to me that, in this space, it seems to me the government is actually sort of leading the charge. As they see these trends emerging, they're moving very swiftly to address them from an enforcement standpoint. And I think what that says to internal auditors is you've got to move with the same speed. You have to. I attended a presentation related to using data analysis for internal control and compliance, and they had survey questions, and I was surprised at the small number of organizations that have really embraced data analytics. And I'm wondering how that's going to intersect with the government's embrace of data analytics. I mean, I think that I would say I think people need to wake up and realize that the government in this case is really moving with great speed, and internal auditors just need to be aware of that and to help with the general counsel's assistance to brief the audit committees and make them aware of the need to develop these capabilities to address the government's expectations.
Right. And I would imagine also that since the government is going to use these tools and is going to take such a more scientific approach to identifying anomalies, then it's in the interest of the organization to identify these things themselves sooner so they can address them and, like you indicated earlier as well, self-report, get in front of the problem as opposed to having limited testing, possibly not identify anomalies and then have the government do it, in which case the situation will be much more harmful to the organization. Bill, thank you very much for helping us better understand some of these dynamics and how the government's approach is changing, evolving, and trying to keep up with some of these technological and risk developments. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You too, Hernan. Thank you.